You know that VisualPolitik is one of the few political channels that pays a lot of attention to Latin America, one of the least covered regions in the world. Perhaps that is why many of you have often asked us to talk more about Latin America. Well, we've got a solution. We're proud to present Latam Politik, a newsletter that we have prepared together with geopolitical consulting firm Perch Perspectives. If you subscribe every month, you will receive 12 newsletters with the best information and analysis on Latin America to keep you up to date and better understand everything that is happening in this region. The cost? You can subscribe for less than 35 cents per newsletter, less than a small taco or a donut a week. In return, you'll be kept up to date on all major happenings in the region and better understand all the possible implications. In addition, all of you who support us at Patreon level 4 and 5 will receive Latam Politik at zero cost. You can find all the info at latampolitik.com. Coronavirus, pandemic, confinement, vaccination. Words that until recently were strange and yet have become part of our everyday vocabulary. Yes, the world has changed, but my friends, what hasn't changed is that a picture is still worth 1,000 words. Take a look at this graph. As you can see, Israel has become the global role model for its COVID-19 vaccination campaigns. To give you an idea, at the beginning of February 2021, when the subject of vaccines was still taboo due to lack of distribution in most developed countries, 4 out of 10 Israelis had already received at least 1 dose of vaccine against SARS-CoV-2. But that's not all. By that time, more than 1/5 of the population was already fully immunized thanks to vaccines. We are talking about almost 2 million people in a country with a population of less than 10 million. However, Israel's fight against the coronavirus is proving to be far more complicated than these figures indicate. Why? Well, basically because a part of the population is reluctant to follow some of the guidelines set by the health authorities.
Israel's leaders clashed with ultra-Orthodox over COVID-19 lockdowns, vaccines. Wall Street Journal.
Ultra-Orthodox Jews place the Torah, the text that contains the laws of the Jewish religion, above all other aspects of daily life. So now the questions that come up are, what are the religious implications for this community in their day-to-day lives? Why are they reluctant to comply with the measures put in place to fight the coronavirus? And perhaps the most important question of all, what other problems arise for the state of Israel that this community, that of the ultra-Orthodox Jews, is becoming larger and larger? And take note, dear friends, because this is one of the great challenges facing the Hebrew nation. So today on VisualPolitik, we are going to answer all these questions. But first, let's take a look at a bit of history.
Those who tremble before God.
Israel is the only country in the world in which Judaism is the majority religion amongst its population. 80% of its citizens profess the Jewish religion. So far, no surprises, right? But the point is that not all Jews are the same. Within Judaism, there are different branches that differ from each other according to the degree of intensity with which their followers live their religion. Most of the Jews of Israel are hiloni, or secular. In fact, we cannot forget that Israel is a state created mainly by people with socialist ideals who, yes, were obviously Jewish, but what they established was precisely a secular state. And today, the population of Israel is still mostly like that. Jews who practice some of their religious practices and traditions, and others who don't. Come on, that happens in any other Western country with a range of religions. But just as there are Jews whose religion has hardly any influence, at the other extreme, we find the ultra-Orthodox Jews. They are the so-called haredim, which in Hebrew means those who tremble before God. But the fact that there is a minority group in a country that places the Jewish law, the Torah, at the center of their lives would have little importance if it were not, friends, because there are more and more of them. The ultra-Orthodox population is growing, and the political parties representing the haredim have more and more presence in Israeli political life to the point of being crucial. And the question is, how did the secular state of Israel come to find itself in this situation? Well, for that, we have to travel to the middle of the 20th century, precisely to the very origin of the state of Israel. In 1948, David Ben-Gurion proclaimed the independence of the State of Israel and became its first prime minister. One of his first decisions was to accept the request of the rabbis to rebuild the legendary yeshivot of Europe in Israel. These were the academies of Torah and Talmud study that had been destroyed during the Holocaust. Israel's political leaders saw ultra-Orthodox Judaism as an anachronism that would soon disappear. Even so, they saw fit to protect traditions that were already in danger of extinction. The yeshivot had always been a place reserved for bright students. Let's say that only the best academic minds were dedicated exclusively to the study of the Torah. So what Ben-Gurion thought was that there would be about 400 yeshiva students, and since there were not many, he granted them the privilege of being exempt from military service. What he didn't count on was that the rabbis would encourage every haredi to enter rabbinic schools, which is exactly what they did. Currently, there are more than 100,000 Haredi men who do not work and spend their days studying the Torah. And you may be wondering, but if they don't work, then how do they support themselves? Well, I could answer for you, but perhaps it's better to look at what Yaakov Litzman, who is currently the leader of one of the main ultra-Orthodox political parties, and who is also the current Minister of Housing, said a few years ago.
Haredi lawmaker, men need not work. Wives and state allowances can pay the bills. Haaretz.
That's exactly what he said. In fact, governments in which the Haredi parties have participated have been dedicated to extending more and more benefits for large families and subsidies to pay for rabbinic school students. As a result, Israel allocates some $300 million of its budget each year to yeshivot alone. And of course, the result of all this is that Haredi men know a lot about their holy books, but very little about the job market. As you can see, half of Haredi men do not work, and it is women who are increasingly joining the labor market. However, the jobs to which ultra-Orthodox people usually have access are more precarious because from a young age they are offered a religious training, not one aimed at carrying out a profession. What's more, haredim cannot accept just any job. They must be jobs that separate men's and women's positions, where the canteen serves kosher food and where the Sabbath is observed. So, the life of the average Haredi woman has become one challenge after another. In addition to financially supporting the family with their jobs outside the home, inside the home, the family burden also falls on the woman. And of course, ultra-Orthodox families are quite large. They have 6 or 7 children as opposed to 2 for the average non-religious family. In fact, this explains why the proportion of the Haredi community among the Israeli population has increased by 30% in just 10 years, from 10% in 2009 to 13% in 2020. By the year 2065, the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community is expected to represent at least 1/3 of the country's population. As it stands today, approximately 25% of the first graders in elementary school belong to ultra-Orthodox families, even though haredim are only 13% of the total population. And my friends, that's how things were when the coronavirus arrived. Listen up.
Pequotch Nefesh.
The coronavirus has taken its toll on Israel's ultra-Orthodox community. It accounts for 1/3 of all COVID-19 infections in the country. And the truth is that it's not easy to determine whether it was due to vulnerability or directly due to irresponsibility, because the mainstream and social media keep circulating photos and videos of large crowds of haredim praying close together, without any social distancing and ignoring the ban on gatherings of more than 10 people, as if we were in 2019. Wow!
April 2nd, 2020. Israeli Health Minister, ultra-Orthodox, positive for coronavirus. Herald.
As you can imagine, most of the Israeli population is outraged with the behavior of the ultra-Orthodox community. Keep in mind that in March 2020, when the coronavirus broke out, they closed all educational institutions while yeshivot and synagogues continued to operate because haredim said that the Torah protects and saves. In the end, the rabbis themselves had to recognize that the Torah is very good for the soul, but to protect one's health, a mask and social distancing are better. Of course, there is always the occasional free spirit.
Ultra-Orthodox rabbi tells followers COVID vaccine can turn people gay. Independent.
Yes, it's true that under normal circumstances, these words would be nothing more than an anecdote, albeit a barbaric one, but at the end of the day, an isolated case. However, what is important is to consider the damage done by a rabbi spreading fake news among the ultra-Orthodox community. The influence exercised by the rabbis over haredim is brutal. They are forbidden, for example, to own televisions or radios. They are allowed to buy cell phones, but as this chart shows, accessing the internet is another matter. All this has created an obstacle for public health recommendations to reach this part of the population. Many haredim do not receive the text messages notifying them that they have been in contact with a COVID-positive person, and obviously, once a haredi is infected, it is very easy for the disease to spread. Remember what we said before, large families, few economic resources. It is not hard to imagine that many of the ultra-Orthodox families live in overcrowded homes, not to mention that many are not willing to give up religious celebrations. In January 2021, thousands of people attended the mass funeral of Rabbi David Soloveitchik, which provoked the anger of the current Minister of Defense, Benny Gantz.
This is what unequal enforcement looks like. Millions of families and children are locked in their homes and abide by the rules, while thousands of ultra-Orthodox crowds at the funeral, most of them even without masks. We will not agree to the continuation of an ineffective closure. Either they close to everyone, or they open to everyone. The days of indulgence are over. Minister of Defense, Benny Gantz.
The truth is that the authorities are afraid to act, because every time police forces have been sent against the ultra-Orthodox crowds, they have literally been met with stones, not to mention the political influence. And then there is the vaccination campaign. You have already seen that Israel became the international benchmark for how to do things. However, that has not been easy either.
Health Minister wants 24/7 vaccinations, but top rabbis said to oppose on Shabbat, times of Israel.
In the end, the minister's judgment prevailed, as you would expect, right? But he had to invoke the pikuach nefesh, a principle of Jewish law, according to which the preservation of human life overrides practically every other religious rule. But hold on a minute, because the rabbis have come out swinging. First, they said that the situation was not serious enough to invoke the pikuach nefesh. Nah, it's just a little pandemic. Then later, they changed their strategy. They went on to say that, okay, there was no problem vaccinating on the Sabbath, but that first, it had to be demonstrated that the vaccine was being administered 24/6, that is, 24 hours a day during the rest of the days of the week, before starting to do it on the Sabbath. Finally, they came out with a statement that what cannot be done on the Sabbath is to record the vaccinated patient's data or drive to the vaccination center. Fortunately for Israelis, the government has taken the coronavirus seriously. And the truth is that their efforts paid off. By mid-February 2021, in areas where the Haredi population is concentrated, 72% of people over 60 had been immunized, just 8% below the national average for that age group. So in this matter at least, danger has been avoided. Even so, the issue of the Sabbath continues to be a talking point in Israeli politics, and it is not the only controversial issue. Let's take a look.
The key to the Knesset.
The ultra-Orthodox Jews never wanted the creation of the State of Israel. For haredim, Zionism and submitting to civil authorities is a kind of heresy. So what did Ben-Gurion do? Well, the same as today's politicians. He sought the support of the ultra-Orthodox rabbis for an independent State of Israel, and Ben-Gurion achieved this by promising them that public services would not operate on the Sabbath. The most obvious result is seen in the public transportation. For more than 70 years, buses and trains have not run in most of Israel from sundown on Friday until Saturday night. And of course, as you can imagine, an overwhelming majority of the Israeli population is sick to death of the weekend arriving and realizing all the things that they can't do because of the Sabbath. And so it continued until the end of 2019, when we can see news stories like this.
Buses overflow as Tel Aviv launches public transportation on Shabbat, times of Israel.
The initiative has been a success and has been copied by other cities. However, it remains to be seen whether it will be maintained over time because the financing of local bodies depends on the Ministry of the Interior. And so far, haredim have benefited from the fact that in the last 2 years, Israel has not had a solid government after going to the polls up to 3 times. March 23rd will be the 4th. The truth is that the pressure exerted by the ultra-Orthodox community bothers Israeli citizens a lot, even a good part of the right-wing voters. But the problem is that the support of the Haredi parties is often vital to form a government. Israel is a parliamentary democracy in which its prime minister is elected by a majority of the Knesset, its legislative assembly. Therefore, the support of 61 of the 120 members of the Knesset is required. For 30 years, no political party has gained more than 40 representatives. That means massive coalition governments have to be formed, in some cases with almost 30 ministries. You know, you've got to keep all the coalition parties happy. Therefore, getting the support of the ultra-Orthodox parties to form a government is very tempting, since between the two parties representing haredim, they usually get about 15 parliamentarians. That's 15 seats closer to 61. So after March 23rd, we will see if the public transportation on the Sabbath is here to stay. And if this is already somewhat controversial, hold on a moment, because there is another issue that outrages Israelis even more. Military service in Israel is compulsory for all citizens. In fact, Israel is one of only 9 countries in the world where women also carry out military service. Even Wonder Woman has done military service. Okay, not Wonder Woman, but Gal Gadot, which provoked such curious news stories as this one.
Wonder Woman, banned in Lebanon, because lead actress is Israeli. CNN.
The fact is that all Israeli citizens perform military service. All? No. The religious community of unyielding haredim resists conscription now and always. Well, actually, the ultra-Orthodox Jews and also the Israeli Arabs, because call me crazy, but it seems to me that no matter how much relations between Israel and other Arab countries have improved, Israel does not look favorably on giving military training to its Arab population. But the fact that very few haredim accepts the 2.5 years of military service for men and 2 years for women bothers the majority of Israeli citizens, who have to interrupt their own studies or professional development to serve the state. As you can imagine, maintaining this exemption is one of the red lines of the Haredi parties. You know, the Torah protects and serves. The problem haredim have is that the Israeli Supreme Court has already declared on 2 occasions that laws exempting ultra-Orthodox Jews from military service are unconstitutional because they are discriminatory. So, the Supreme Court has opened a temporary deadline for a non-discriminatory regulation to be developed. The aim is to make the obligation to incorporate the Haredi community into the military service progressive and respecting all their particularities. You know, kosher food, that men do not share spaces with women. However, as we told you before, Israel has not had a solid government for 2 years and the deadline has run out. The latest information is that a final extension has been requested.
AG requests universal IDF draft apply to Haredi sector on July 6th. Jerusalem Post.
In short, this issue has every chance of being one of the main topics on the negotiating table of the next Israeli government or governments. We will keep an eye on this issue at VisualPolitik, and we will also tell you more about the challenges this community poses for the future of the state of Israel. But now the question is over to you. Do you think Israel will end up creating a Haredi battalion, or will this group continue to join the army in dribs and drabs? Will the state of Israel be able to withstand the pressure of a growing population that refuses to work and depends on the public coffers for their livelihood? Leave us your answer in the comments, and if you found this video interesting, then please give it a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. All the best. I'll see you next time.
If you want to learn more about politics and world affairs and hear some more of my lovely voice, come check out the Reconsider podcast, where we don't do the thinking for you. Find Reconsider at www.reconsidermedia.com or on Apple or Google Play or your favorite podcatcher.